The story of Napoleon Bonaparte does not begin in glory. It begins with struggle. Born in 1769 on the rugged island of Corsica, Napoleon entered a world already filled with conflict. Just a year before his birth, Corsica had been taken over by France. His family supported the losing side, the Corsican resistance. That meant from the very beginning, Napoleon was caught between two identities. Not fully French, yet no longer truly Corsican. As a child, Napoleon was quiet, intense, and often isolated. He spoke French with a heavy Corsican accent, which made him an easy target for ridicule when he was sent to school in mainland France. Imagine being a young boy, far from home, surrounded by wealthier students who mocked your background, your speech, even your dreams. But instead of breaking him, this rejection forged something stronger. Napoleon turned inward. He read obsessively, history, philosophy, and especially stories of great leaders like Alexander the Great. These tales didn't just entertain him, they shaped him. He began to see himself not as an outsider, but as someone destined for greatness. At the military academy of Briand-le-Château Military School, Napoleon stood out, not because he was popular, but because he was brilliant. He excelled in mathematics, a skill that would later make him a master of artillery and battlefield strategy. While others played, Napoleon studied. While others laughed, he planned. Yet beneath his discipline burned a fierce ambition. He didn't just want to succeed. He wanted to rise above everyone who had ever doubted him. Every insult, every moment of loneliness became fuel for a greater purpose. By the age of 16, Napoleon graduated and became a young artillery officer in the French army. It wasn't a glamorous position, but it was a start, a small step towards something much bigger. The boy who once felt like an outsider was now standing at the edge of opportunity, and history was about to give him his chance. The year is 1789, and everything is about to change. In France, anger had been building for years. The people were hungry, the economy was collapsing, and the monarchy seemed completely out of touch. Then, like a spark in a dry forest, the French Revolution erupted, shattering the old world and creating chaos in its wake. For many, this chaos meant danger. But for Napoleon Bonaparte, it meant opportunity. At this time, Napoleon was still a young artillery officer, ambitious, but largely unknown. The rigid class system that once blocked his path was now crumbling. Noble officers were fleeing or being executed, leaving behind empty positions in the army. For the first time, talent, not birth, could determine success. Napoleon saw it clearly. This was his moment. But the revolution was not a calm or orderly change. It was violent, unpredictable, and often brutal. Streets filled with protests, riots, and bloodshed. The execution of Louis XVI sent shockwaves across Europe. France was no longer just in turmoil. It was at war, both within and beyond its borders. Napoleon didn't hesitate. He threw himself into the revolutionary cause, aligning with leaders who supported the new republic. He wrote passionately about politics, supported the ideals of merit and equality, and most importantly, he proved himself on the battlefield. His expertise in artillery began to set him apart. While others relied on tradition, Napoleon used precision, speed, and calculation. He understood that wars were not just fought with courage, but with intelligence. Still, his journey was far from easy. There were moments when his political alliances nearly destroyed him. At one point, he was even arrested during the shifting tides of power. Imagine it. So close to rising, yet on the verge of being forgotten forever. But Napoleon had something many others lacked: timing and relentless determination. He adapted quickly, shifting with the changing political winds without losing sight of his ultimate goal. Where others saw uncertainty, he saw a ladder. Every battle, every decision, every risk pushed him forward. The revolution was burning through France, destroying the old world piece by piece. And in those flames, Napoleon Bonaparte was rising. The unknown officer was no longer invisible. He was getting closer to becoming unstoppable. The revolution raged on, but in 1793, it brought France to the brink of disaster. A powerful southern port city, Toulon, had turned against the revolution. Royalists inside the city opened the gates to foreign enemies, inviting the forces of Britain and its allies to take control. Suddenly, France wasn't just fighting internal rebellion. It was facing invasion from one of the strongest navies in the world. Losing Toulon would be catastrophic. The revolutionary government needed a solution, fast, and a Napoleon Bonaparte. At just 24 years old, Napoleon was still a relatively unknown artillery officer. But when he arrived at the battlefield, he immediately saw what others could not. The French army had been attacking blindly, wasting time and lives. Napoleon studied the terrain, the enemy positions and the coastline, and within days, he formed a bold plan. Instead of directly assaulting the city, he proposed something radical: capture the high ground overlooking the harbor. If they controlled those key positions, they could aim their cannons directly at the British fleet, forcing them to retreat. It was a risky move, but it was brilliant. At first, his ideas were met with doubt. Who was this young officer to challenge experienced commanders? But the situation was desperate, and eventually they gave him a chance. Napoleon wasted no time. He reorganized the artillery, positioned cannons with precision, and led attacks with relentless energy. Under his direction, the French forces struck exactly where it mattered most. The fighting was intense. Smoke filled the air, cannon fire shook the ground, and soldiers clashed in brutal combat. Then came the turning point. Napoleon's forces seized the critical fortifications overlooking the harbor. With cannons now aimed at the enemy's ships, the British fleet was suddenly exposed. Staying meant destruction. They had no choice. They withdrew. Toulon was saved. In one decisive victory, Napoleon had done what others failed to do. He didn't just win a battle. He changed the course of the war. And France took notice. Almost overnight, the young, overlooked officer was promoted to brigadier general. His name began to spread, whispered in military circles and political halls alike. This was more than a victory. This was the moment Napoleon Bonaparte stopped being just another soldier and became a commander to watch. The outsider was rising, fast, and this was only the beginning. Victory at Toulon had changed everything. But for Napoleon Bonaparte, it was only the beginning. By 1796, France was still surrounded by enemies. One of the most dangerous fronts lay to the southeast, where the powerful forces of Austria and its allies dominated northern Italy. The French army stationed there was weak, poorly supplied, and constantly losing. Morale was at its lowest. Then came a bold decision. Napoleon, young and proven at high command, and only 26 years old, was given control of the army of Italy. To many, it seemed like a mistake. To Napoleon, it was destiny. When he arrived, he found starving soldiers, torn uniforms, and little hope. But instead of despair, he gave them something powerful: belief. He stood before his troops and promised them glory, victory, and riches. He told them that beyond the mountains lay fertile lands waiting to be conquered. His words were electric. Suddenly, the broken army began to transform. But words alone wouldn't win battles. Napoleon moved fast, faster than any general his enemies had ever faced. Instead of fighting large, slow battles, he divided his enemies and struck them one by one. His strategy was simple yet devastating: speed, surprise, and precision. Against all expectations, he began to win. Battle after battle, Napoleon crushed Austrian forces, pushing them back across Italy. His troops, once starving and defeated, were now confident and unstoppable. Cities fell, enemy lines collapsed, and his legend began to grow. One of his greatest strengths was how he saw the battlefield, not as chaos, but as a puzzle. Where others saw confusion, he saw opportunity. He predicted enemy movements, exploited their weaknesses, and attacked where they least expected. Soon, even his enemies feared him. The young general was no longer just lucky, he was brilliant. His campaign reached its peak as he forced Austria into submission, leading to the Treaty of Campo Formio. France gained vast territories, and Napoleon returned home not just as a general, but as a hero. Crowds cheered his name. Leaders took notice. His influence grew beyond the battlefield. But with every victory, something else was growing too: his ambition. Napoleon had proven he could win wars. Now he would begin to wonder, could he rule a nation? The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer a possibility. It was becoming inevitable. Napoleon had returned from Italy a hero, But back in France, victory on the battlefield had not brought stability. The revolution that once promised freedom had descended into confusion. The government, known as the French Directory, was weak, corrupt, and deeply unpopular. Economic crises worsened. Political conspiracies spread. The people were tired, and the nation was on the edge of collapse. France didn't just need a leader. It needed control. And once again, Napoleon Bonaparte saw his moment. By now, Napoleon was more than a general. He was a symbol of strength. His victories had made him famous, his presence commanding. But he knew that power on the battlefield was not enough. To truly shape France, he needed political power. So he began a plan. Behind the scenes, Napoleon aligned himself with key political figures, including the influential Emmanuel Joseph Size. Together, they crafted a bold and dangerous idea: overthrow the Directory and replace it with a new government, one that Napoleon could control. The date was set, November 1799, or as it was known in revolutionary terms, the 18th of Brumaire. The plan was risky. If it failed, Napoleon would be branded a traitor or worse. But hesitation was never his style. On that tense day, troops loyal to Napoleon surrounded the legislative councils. Confusion spread among the politicians as they were moved outside Paris under the pretense of safety. But soon, the truth became clear. This was no protection. It was a takeover. Inside the council chambers, chaos erupted. Some members resisted, shouting accusations, calling Napoleon a dictator. For a brief moment, everything nearly fell apart. Napoleon himself faced intense opposition, his authority challenged, his plan on the verge of collapse. But then decisive action. His allies stepped in. Soldiers entered the chamber, dispersing the resistance and restoring order by force. The Directory was dissolved. The old government was no more. In its place, a new system was created, the consulate, and at its head stood Napoleon as first consul. It was a title that sounded temporary, but in reality, it marked the beginning of something far greater. In one bold move, Napoleon had seized control of France. No longer just a general, no longer just a hero, he was now the most powerful man in the nation. The outsider from Corsica had risen through war, revolution, and chaos to claim power at the very top. But this was not the end of his story. This was only the beginning of an empire